Good afternoon. Faculty, students, staff, alumni, and guests, welcome to the 2016-17 Wilson Lecture, Wellesley's premier lecture of the academic year. It's wonderful to see so many members of the Wellesley community here for what I know will be a thought-provoking lecture from one of the nation's most influential thinkers in the social sciences. Tonight, we have the honor of hearing from Professor William Julius Wilson, award-winning scholar and groundbreaking author of the seminal books, The Truly Disadvantaged and When Work Disappears, among so many others. Professor Wilson is the Louis P. and Linda L. Geiser University Professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where he directs the Joblessness and Urban Poverty Research Program in the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy. Professor Wilson's presentation is entitled Reflections on Race, Class, and Cumulative Adversity. Perhaps the nation's foremost scholar of urban poverty over the course of his distinguished career, Professor Wilson has been named the most influential sociologist of his generation by the Washington Post and one of the 25 most influential people in the United States by Time magazine. The reach and impact of his work, his prolific record of scholarship, his numerous academic honors, including a MacArthur Genius Award and the National Medal of Science, the country's most prestigious scientific award, just to name a few. All of this makes Dr. Wilson one of the most respected voices in his field. He has been called one of the nation's most accomplished and looked-to analysts of race, inequality, and poverty. The National Medal of Science citation honoring Professor Wilson praised him for his innovative approach to studying urban poverty and his belief that the rigorous pursuit of social science will improve his fellow Americans' lives. The citation goes on to commend his advocacy of policies which reflect more accurately what we have learned from his research and the ways in which this broadens our view of how race, class, and location interact. His provocative and challenging ideas, in fact, shaped the national discourse on those complicated and difficult to map interactions and interconnections. Also importantly, Professor Wilson has influenced more than a generation of social scientists, both directly as a teacher and mentor and through his scholarship. Wellesley's own Michael Jeffries, Associate Professor of American Studies, was a former student of Dr. Wilson's. We owe Professor Jeffries a debt of gratitude for helping bring a scholar of Dr. Wilson's stature to Wellesley. Thank you, Michael. I should also add that Professor Wilson's writings informed my own thinking about the social determinants of health as I built my career, and I remember the excitement that I experienced when he moved from the University of Chicago to Harvard in 1996. And I want to say, as I said to Professor Wilson in the back, it took my coming to Wellesley to meet him. Dr. Wilson epitomizes the kind of public intellectual we at Wellesley so greatly value. His work influences public policy and scholarship. His ideas reach into economics, history, political science, and the law. We have an abiding interest in Dr. Wilson's focus on race, class, and equity here at Wellesley. Here we focus on equity as critical and as an essential element to our pursuit of excellence. Equity and excellence together in concert, fostering challenging but an inclusive academic experience. So through his presence, Dr. Wilson honors the venerable group of leaders, scholars, and activists who have previously delivered the annual Wilson Lecture. Named for alumna Carolyn A. Wilson, class of 1910, this lecture makes it possible for us to bring to campus renowned speakers to discuss today's most significant issues. Carolyn was a trailblazing reporter for the Chicago Tribune. I think that's a confluence of time. One of the very few women anywhere in the world to cover World War I. So tonight, we are so fortunate to have Dr. William Julius Wilson as this year's Wilson Lecturer, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor William Julius Wilson.
President Johnson, members of the faculty and administration, students and guests, it's my distinct honor to deliver this year's Carolyn A. Wilson Lecture at this historic college. Now, some of my remarks this evening will be provocative, but I feel we are now in a period where one should not hesitate to advance thoughtful ideas to improve conditions for ordinary Americans. So let me begin. In November, shortly before the presidential election, I received an email from my Harvard colleague, Henry Louis Gates, Jr. We call him Skip Gates, who said he had to do a coda to the HBO television series, Black Americas After MLK, to bring it up to date. And he asked me if I was optimistic or pessimistic about the future of our people. He said he actually heard a guy on Anderson Cooper's CNN News show say that this is the worst time in the history of our people. And Skip Gates added, this is surely not true, but he would love to get my thoughts about this. And I said, I completely agree that it cannot be true. Anybody who says this is the worst time in the history of African Americans does not have a sense of history. In general, nothing today compares with slavery or Jim Crow segregation. However, I also pointed out that it would be accurate to say that since the death of Martin Luther King Jr., conditions for poor blacks have deteriorated, while the conditions of better off blacks have improved. And this is most clearly seen in the growing income inequality in the black community, as reflected in the Gini ratio. The Gini ratio is a measure of income inequality ranging from 0, perfect equality, to 1, maximum inequality. Now, this figure discloses the increasing household income inequality across the American population as a whole. Look at the blue line. Rising from a low of 0.39 in 1970 to 0.48 in 2013. More interesting, however, is a high level of intra-group inequality among black households. Although the absolute level of black income is well below that of whites, blacks nonetheless display the most intra-group inequality, reaching a household Gini index of 0.49 in 2013 followed by whites at 0.47 and Hispanics at 0.45. Indeed, one of the significant changes since Dr. King's passing is the remarkable gains in income among more affluent blacks. When adjusted for inflation to 2014 dollars, the percentage of black Americans making at least $75,000 more than doubled from 1970 to 2014 to 21%. Those making $100,000 or more nearly quadrupled to 13%. Now, in contrast, white Americans saw a less impressive increase from 11 to 26%. On the other hand, the percentage of black Americans with incomes below $15,000 only declined by 4 percentage points to 22%. Now, research reveals that income inequality is related to income segregation. This figure presents data on income segregation by race in metropolitan areas with populations of more than 500,000. And the source for this figure is a 2014 study by the sociologists Kendra Bischoff and Sean Reardon. This figure reveals that income segregation has grown rapidly in the last decade, and particularly among black and Hispanic families. And what is notable is that whereas African American families in 1970, you know, I'm partially colorblind, that's red, right? Okay. So, whereas African American families in 1970 recorded the least income segregation, they now register the highest income segregation. Now, please note that we're talking here about residential segregation among black families of different income levels, not segregation between black and white families. And another way of talking about these trend lines is that they describe the extent to which the exposure of families to neighbors of the same race has changed over time. And although income segregation among black families grew considerably in the 1970s and the 1980s, as you can see, it grew even more rapidly from 2000 to 2009 after slightly declining in the 1990s. And when considering a person's life trajectory or life chances, the differences in the quality of one's daily life between residing in a predominantly affluent neighborhood and a poor black neighborhood are huge. And it is important to note that today, poor black families have fewer middle-class neighbors than they had in 1970. Indeed, the rising income segregation in the black community is driven both by the growth of affluent blacks and the deteriorating conditions of poor blacks. And I wish I could share these figures with Donald Trump, who tends to talk about African Americans as if they are a monolithic socioeconomic group, that is a severely disadvantaged group that has made little progress. Indeed, he is quoted as saying that black communities are in the worst shape ever. Well, that's, if you look at different black communities, you can hardly say that. Some are in the worst shape ever, the poor communities that I'll be talking about later. And since I mentioned Trump, I should say that racial tensions and the expression of racial antagonisms seemed to have increased after he decided to run for the presidency, which is probably one of the reasons why the guy on CNN proclaimed that this is the worst time in the history of African Americans. Now, this spike in racial tensions should not come as a big surprise. We must understand that racial antagonisms are products of situations, economic situations, political situations, and social situations. Average citizens do not fully understand the complex forces that have increased their economic woes, the declines in real family income, the rise in wage dispersion, changes in the global economy, industry, relocation, and so on. Now, it's interesting that I made the same argument in 1999 in my book, The Bridge Over the Racial Divide, Rising Inequality and Coalition Politics, published by the University of California Press. More specifically, I pointed out in that book that economic insecurities create conditions that are breeding grounds for racial and ethnic tensions. And I wrote in 1999 that, in, quote, this social climate, some conservatives in the United States have attempted to unite white Americans around anger at the government and racial minorities, unquote. Now, it's noteworthy that the same dynamics characterize the Trump presidential campaign 2 decades later. When I wrote my book in 1999, messages from those on the right were more concerned with controlling blacks than controlling immigrants. However, the messages of these 2 different time periods are basically the same. Whereas Donald Trump and his supporters highlight the negative traits of immigrants and their threat to American society, I pointed out in my 1999 book that conservative supporters of welfare reform implicitly communicated the view that blacks were undeserving of special treatment from the government and that their high rates of welfare were due to personal shortcomings, including a lack of work ethic. And just as conservative Republicans use these contentious messages in gaining control of the U.S. Congress in the congressional elections of 1994, so too did Donald Trump successfully employ a similar set of messages in his successful presidential campaign of 2016. But let me get back to what I was saying about the good news and bad news in the black community. In order to keep things in proper perspective, when talking about the relative gains of more privileged blacks, it is important not to overlook the continuing interracial disparities. For example, a report from the Center for Economic and Policy Research reveals that before the Great Recession, there was only a 1.4 percentage point difference in the unemployment gap between recent black and white college graduates aged 22 to 27. However, in 2013, shortly after the economic downturn, the gap had surged to a 7.5 percentage point difference. Now, race is obviously a factor at play because historically, the periods during and immediately after downturns have adversely impacted blacks more than whites. and the issues involving race in these intergroup comparisons are complex. For example, aside from the role of racial discrimination, whites with the same amount of schooling as blacks usually attend better high schools and colleges, and therefore have an edge when employers rely on such criteria, especially during slack labor markets, that is, periods of higher unemployment. Also, researchers at the Pew Research Center released data showing that the median financial wealth of white households in 2013 exceeded that of black households by almost $131,000. So, despite sharp increases in income inequality and income segregation among blacks, the interracial disparities between blacks and whites remain huge and must always be kept in mind when discussing and highlighting growing intra-racial differences. That said, and I repeat, the conditions for poor blacks have deteriorated since the death of Martin Luther King, while those of better off blacks have improved. A blanket statement that things are worse now for blacks than ever before is totally unwarranted. But Skip Gates asked me if I am optimistic or pessimistic about the future of our people. And let me say that I am somewhat optimistic about the future of trained and educated blacks, and very pessimistic about the future of poorly educated blacks. And before I elaborate on why I am pessimistic about the conditions of poor blacks, let me partly qualify my optimism about the future of trained and educated blacks. In so doing, I want to talk about the importance and continued need for affirmative action programs. Research suggests that the white backlash against racial entitlements, such as affirmative action, contributed to the government's retreat from anti-discrimination policies during the 1980s. And many of the gains that trained and educated blacks made in the 1970s were erased during the years of the Reagan administration. It should not be surprising that waning support for affirmative action programs would have an adverse effect on African Americans in particular. For example, a number of empirical studies have revealed significant differences in the family environment and neighborhood environment of blacks and whites that are understated when standard measures of socioeconomic status are employed. Take, for example, the question of family background. Even when white parents and black parents report the same average income, white parents have substantially more assets than do black parents. And as I pointed out previously, whites with the same amount of schooling as blacks usually attend better high schools and colleges. Furthermore, children's test scores are associated not only with the social and economic status of their parents, but also affected by the social and economic status of their grandparents. And this means that it could take several generations before adjustments in socioeconomic inequality produce their full benefits. Thus, if we were to rely solely on the standard criteria of college admissions in highly selective colleges and universities like SAT scores, even many children from black middle-income families would be denied admission in favor of middle-income whites who are not weighed down by the accumulation of disadvantages that stem from racial restrictions and who therefore tend to score higher on these conventional tests. For all of these reasons, The success of younger educated blacks remains dependent on affirmative action programs whereby more flexible merit-based criteria of evaluation are used to gauge potential to succeed. Now notice I said flexible merit-based criteria of evaluation. Implicit in this argument is a view that the remedy does not have to consist of numerical guidelines or quotas. The remedy can be a different set of evaluation criteria, new, more flexible, yet merit-based criteria that are more accurate than the conventional tests, engaging the actual potential of Black Americans to succeed. Indeed, it is not readily apparent to what extent the standard measures of aptitude like the SAT, or even tests widely used for promoting police officers, measure real merit and not just privilege. The research reveals that for most applicants, these tests are only tenuously related to future performance. High school grades consistently predict college freshman grades more accurately than the SAT in both selective and non-selective colleges. And little predictive power is gained by combining the SAT with school grades. And while some cognitive test scores may correlate better with outcomes, even these do not necessarily measure important attributes that also determine performance, such as perseverance, motivation, interpersonal skills, reliability, and leadership qualities. For example, if you compare youngsters from the ghettos of Roxbury or Harlem or East St. Louis who display these traits, perseverance, motivation, interpersonal skills, reliability, and leadership qualities, and youngsters from white suburbia who have higher SAT scores but do not possess these traits, the chances are good, I believe, that the inner city kids will experience a higher level of college achievement and a more enriching college experience. Now, the policy implications are obvious. Race-specific policies like affirmative action will be required for the foreseeable future to ensure the continued mobility of educated blacks. But affirmative action programs are not really designed to address the problems of the most disadvantaged and poorest people of color, especially those who live in impoverished inner city ghettos. And because of time constraints, let me focus on just a few of the things that make me pessimistic about the future of poor blacks, beginning with education in public schools. Now, research by the sociologist Sean Reardon reveals that schools with high proportion of black students or high proportion of Hispanic students typically tend to be schools with high proportions of poor students. And although this finding suggests a strong association between residential segregation and racial achievement gaps, the key dimension driving this association is the proportion of students, classmates who are poor. Indeed, a school's poverty rate could be a proxy for general school quality. Schools with high poverty rates may have fewer resources overall, and we definitely need more research to help explain the impact of concentrated poverty in urban public schools. There are a number of factors to take into account. First of all, such schools may experience a greater difficulty in attracting and retaining, competent or skilled teachers. Also, the parents of the students in these schools generally have fewer resources, cultural capital, and human capital that would be beneficial to their children's academic achievement. This means that schools with a higher percentage of poor students tend to have a higher percentage of low-performing students. which may result in the school offering less advanced curricula. In other words, having low-performing classmates may have an adverse effect on learning by altering instructional and social processes in the classroom. Moreover, a recent study by Robert Sampson and his colleagues show that residing in a severely disadvantaged neighborhood cumulatively impedes the development of academically relevant verbal ability in children, which affects school performance. Furthermore, the direct and indirect effect of peer influence, the direct and indirect effects of peer influence have to be considered. Students from disadvantaged backgrounds are less likely to see a strong association between schooling and post-school employment. And finally, we have to factor in other conditions that are not usually associated with school performance. But research suggests that these factors are important. And I have in mind, for example, the impact of lead contamination on poor children who live in dilapidated buildings on school performance, the effect of home evictions on children's school performance that my Harvard colleague Matt Desmond talks about, and the impact of the psychological trauma of witnessing a killing in your neighborhood on school performance. Now, when you consider these combined factors, it's very difficult to deny the proposition that both residential segregation and school segregation contribute to the racial achievement gap. What is not clear is how they are interrelated and their relative importance. And since students tend to attend schools relatively close to home, residential segregation is a major factor shaping patterns of school segregation. But we should carefully distinguish between the two types of residential segregation I talked about: racial segregation and income segregation. Poor inner-city black neighborhoods feature both racial and income separation, and many, especially those in the Northeast and Midwest, are characterized by increasing and prolonged joblessness, a diminishing proportion of non-poor families, and overall depopulation, making it more difficult to sustain basic institutions or to achieve adequate levels of neighborhood social organization. Now, the result is what we call a weak institutional resource base. You see, it is easier for parents to control the behavior of the children in their neighborhood when a strong institutional resource base exists, and when the links between community institutions, such as churches, schools, political organizations, businesses, and civic clubs are strong or secure. The higher the density and stability of formal organizations, the less illicit activities such as drug trafficking, crime, prostitution, and the formation of gangs can take root in the neighborhood. Take drug trafficking. Research reveals an association between declining legitimate employment opportunities among inner-city residents and increased incentives to sell drugs. And neighborhoods plagued by high levels of joblessness, insufficient economic opportunities, and high residential mobility are unable to control the volatile drug market and the violent crimes related to it. As a result, the behavior and norms in the drug market are more likely to influence the actions of others in the neighborhood, even those who are not directly involved in drug activity. Drug dealers escalate the use and spread of guns in the neighborhood, which in turn raises the likelihood that others, particularly youngsters, will come to view the possession of weapons as necessary or desirable for self-protection, settling disputes, and gaining respect from peers and other individuals. The drug industry actively recruits teenagers in a neighborhood, not only because they are willing to accept lower wages, but also because they tend to be more courageous and will take risks that more mature adults would avoid. Inner-city black youth with limited prospects for stable and attractive employment are easily lured into drug trafficking and therefore invariably find themselves involved in the violent behavior that accompanies it. To repeat, drug trafficking flows in a neighborhood with a weak institutional resource base, which is what distinguishes high inner-city jobless neighborhoods from stable middle-class and working-class areas. Parents in these high jobless neighborhoods have a much more difficult time of controlling the behavior of their adolescents, of preventing them from getting involved in activities detrimental to pro-social development, activities that spill over into the classroom and affect academic achievement. So I think it's very important that when we discuss the important relationship between residential segregation and school segregation, we are really talking about the type of residential segregation that is most likely to lead to the highest concentration of poor students of color in neighborhood public schools, the segregation that combines racial and income separation. And this is the kind of segregation that we absolutely have to overcome to reduce the racial disparities and students' exposure to poor classmates, which might be an effective way of improving the quality of students' access to better educational opportunities. And I strongly see the need for greater investment in educational institutions and for programs that provide greater opportunity for occupational mobility so that more youngsters who have been raised in poor families and grown up in poor neighborhoods will improve their chances in life. And this will call for income redistribution through welfare and tax policies, resulting in greater public investment to improve the conditions in poor black neighborhoods, as well as the institutions that serve individuals and families in these neighborhoods. But for the foreseeable future, especially given the present political climate, only the most optimistic observers would anticipate that such a program would receive the necessary public and political support. Thus, to repeat, whereas the future of privileged blacks, like the privileged members of other groups, looks relatively good, the future of poorer blacks looks very bleak indeed. And nowhere is this more apparent. Nowhere is this more apparent than when you look at the plight of low-skilled black males. The disproportionate number of low-skilled black males in this country is one of the legacies of historic segregation and discrimination. Now, a number of factors have resulted in the low position of black males in this country. And these forces include changes in the relative demand for low-skilled labor caused by the computer revolution, the globalization of economic activity, the declining manufacturing sector, the growth of service industries, where most of the new jobs for workers with limited skills and education are concentrated. And given time constraints, I would like to focus on this last factor associated with the relatively high jobless rate of low-skilled black men, the gradual shift from manufacturing to service industries. This shift has created a set of problems for low-skilled black males because those industries feature jobs that require workers to serve and relate to consumers. In a study we conducted in Chicago in the early 1990s, whose findings are still very relevant, many employers of entry-level jobs favored women and recent immigrants of both genders who have come to populate the labor pool in the low-wage service sector over black males for entry-level service jobs. Employers in service industries felt that consumers perceived inner-city black males to be dangerous or threatening, in part because of their high incarceration rates. You see, in the past, African American males simply had to demonstrate a strong back and muscles to be hired for physical labor in a factory, at a construction site, or on an assembly line. They interacted with peers and foremen, not with consumers. Today, they have to search for work in the service sector, where employers are less likely to hire them because they are seen as unable to sustain positive contact with the public. Employers maintain that black males lack the soft skills that their jobs require, the tendency to maintain eye contact, the ability to carry on polite and friendly conversations with consumers, the inclination to smile and be responsive to consumer requests, however demanding and unreasonable they may seem. Consequently, black male job seekers face rising rates of rejection. Also, the physical and social isolation of minorities living in inner-city areas of concentrated poverty severely limit the access the poor black males have to informal job networks, the casual networks of people or acquaintances who can pass along information about employment prospects. Now, this is a significant problem for black males, especially considering that many low-skilled employees first learn about their jobs through an acquaintance or were recommended by someone associated with a company. Research suggests that only a small percentage of low-skilled employees are hired through advertised job openings or cold calls. The importance of knowing someone who knows the boss is illustrated by this employer's comments about a young black male to one of our interviewers. He states, quote, "All of a sudden, they take a look at a guy, and unless he's got it in, the reason why I hired this black kid the last time is because my neighbor said to me, yeah, I used him for a few days. He's good." And I said, you know what? I'm going to take a chance. But it was a recommendation. But other than that, I've got a walk-in, and who knows? And I think for the most part, a guy sees a black male, he's a bit hesitant, unquote. Now, such attitudes are classic examples of what social scientists call statistical discrimination. Now, I use the term statistical discrimination here because the black employers in our sample also expressed a reluctance to hire inner-city black males. Basically, the employers, both black and white, make generalizations about inner-city black male workers and reach decisions based on those assumptions without reviewing the qualifications of an individual applicant. And the net effect is that inner-city black male applicants are never given the opportunity, in many cases, to prove themselves. Now, although some of these men scorn entry-level jobs because of the poor working conditions and low wages, many others would readily accept such employment. And although statistical discrimination contains some elements of class bias against poor inner-city workers, it is clearly a racially motivated practice. Employers believe that women and recent immigrants of both genders are better suited than black males, especially those with prison records, for jobs in the low-wage service sector. And this image has been partly created by cultural shifts in national attitudes that reflect concerns about the high rate of violence in the ghettos. In the eyes of many Americans, black males symbolize this violence. Cries for law and order resulted in a more punitive criminal justice system and a dramatic increase in black male incarceration. And the high incarceration rates of low-skilled black males are very much connected to their high jobless rates. It's a vicious cycle. Being without a job can encourage illegal money-making activities in order to make ends meet, which increases the risk of incarceration. And upon release from incarceration, a prison record carries a stigma in the eyes of employers and decreases the possibility that an ex-offender will be hired, resulting in a greater likelihood of even more intractable joblessness. Forced to turn to the low-wage service sector for employment, inner-city black males, including a significant number of ex-offenders, have to compete, often unsuccessfully, with a growing number of female and immigrant workers. If these men complain or otherwise manifest their dissatisfaction, they seem even more unattractive to employers and therefore encounter even greater discrimination when they search for employment. And because the feelings many inner-city black males express about their job and job prospects reflect their plummeting position in a changing economy, it is important to link these attitudes with the opportunity structure, that is, the spectrum of life chances available to them in society at large. And this brings me to the subject of Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter movement has dramatically called attention to violent police encounters with blacks, especially young black males, who, given their very circumstances, are more likely to have confrontations with the police, which reinforces the negative perceptions that they have garnered. Aided by smartphones and social media, Americans have now become more aware of these incidents, which very likely have occurred at similar levels in previous decades, but were under the radar. However, I think it would be good to expand the focus of the movement to include groups that are not usually referenced when we discuss Black Lives Matter. And I am referring to ordinary residents who are often innocent victims of criminal offenses in poor inner-city neighborhoods and have called for more police protection, not less. And to repeat, these people are usually not referenced when we talk about Black Lives Matter. And in this connection, I recall a conversation I had several decades ago with a mother who resided in one of the poor inner-city neighborhoods on Chicago's South Side. She was distraught. A stray bullet from a gang fight had killed her son, who was not a gang member. She sadly lamented that his death was not reported in any of the Chicago newspapers or in the Chicago electronic media. And I distinctly remember her saying, "No one cared, Mr. Wilson, that my son died. No one cared." Now, as I pointed out previously, when income segregation is coupled with racial segregation, low-income blacks cluster in neighborhoods that feature disadvantages along several dimensions, including exposure to violent crime. This figure captures this graphically. In 1978, poor blacks aged 12 and over were marginally more likely than affluent blacks to be violent crime victims, roughly 45 and 38 per 1,000 individuals, respectively. However, by 2008, poor blacks were far more likely to be violent crime victims, about 75 per 1,000, while affluent blacks were far less likely to be victims of violent crime, about 23 per 1,000. And violent crime can reach extraordinary levels in the poorest inner-city black neighborhoods. For example, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where 46% of African Americans live in high-poverty neighborhoods. High-poverty neighborhoods, those with poverty rates of at least 40%. Blacks are nearly 20 times more likely to get shot than a white person, and 9 times more likely to be murdered. Now, some people are reluctant to talk about the high murder rate in cities like Milwaukee because, one, it might distract our attention from the vital discussion about police violence against blacks, and two, it runs the risk of providing ammunition to those who resist criminal justice reform efforts regarding policing and sentencing policy. But Gio Leovy of the Los Angeles Times, and author of the book Ghetto Side, published in 2014, raises another issue. She asserts, and reminds me of this young mother in Chicago. Well, she wasn't so young, but the mother in Chicago. She asserts that the relatively low priority placed on solving the high murder rates in poor inner-city neighborhoods, as reflected in the woefully inadequate resources provided to homicide detectives struggling to solve killings in those areas, represents one of the great moral failings of our criminal justice system and of our society. Indeed, the thousands of poor, grieving African American families whose loved ones have been killed tend to be disregarded or ignored even by the media. And although the nation's consciousness has been aroused by the repeated acts of police brutality against blacks, the problems of public space violence seen in the extraordinary distress, trauma, and pain many poor inner-city families experience following the killing of a family member or close relative also deserves our special attention. The use of a phrase, "the other side of Black Lives Matter," the other side of Black Lives Matter, coined by my former student, Loic Waquant of the University of California, Berkeley, could help to create such awareness. Now, when I wrote the book I referred to earlier, The Bridge Over the Racial Divide, in 1999, I was hopeful that we could create a climate in the United States that could lead to a constructive dialogue on how problems associated with the disappearance of work among certain segments of our population can be addressed, including problems that result in neighborhood violence that traumatize the residents. And despite the fact that such problems tend to be more severe in poor inner city neighborhoods, I nonetheless felt back in 1999 that they should be discussed not in isolation, but as a part of a more general dialogue which focuses on the concerns of ordinary Americans, concerns that the poor, working and middle classes of all groups share, including concerns about crime in their neighborhoods, declining real wages, job security and unemployment, escalating medical and housing costs, and the availability of affordable child care programs. And I also argued that programs created in response to these concerns, despite being race neutral, would, and I'm quoting myself, disproportionately benefit the inner city jobless poor, but they would also benefit large segments of the remaining population, including the white population, unquote. And I stated that the framers of this message should be cognizant of the fact, quoting myself again, that these groups, although often seen as adversaries, are potential allies in a reform coalition because they suffer from a common problem, economic distress caused by forces outside of their control, unquote. Now, this argument is as true today as it was when I wrote The Bridge Over the Racial Divide in 1999, and it is being repeated by some observers in the U.S. post-election analysis and debates, including those who maintain that the Democrats' emphasis on identity politics and attempt to mobilize people of color, women, immigrants, and the LGBT community tended to ignore the problems of poor white Americans. One notable example they point out was Bernie Sanders' progressive and unifying populist economic message in the Democratic primaries, a message that resonated with a significant segment of the white, lower, and working class populations. However, Sanders was not the Democratic nominee, and Donald Trump was able to capture significant support from these populations with a divisive, not unifying, populist message. So I end this lecture by once again returning to some of the arguments I presented in my 1999 book, The Bridge Over the Racial Divide. Arguments that are even more relevant now in the age of Donald Trump. Because the problems of social inequality, the gap between the expanding have-nots and haves, are growing more severe, a vision that acknowledges racially distinct problems and the need for remedies like affirmative action, but at the same time emphasizes the importance of multiracial solutions to shared problems, is more important now than ever. A new democratic vision must reject the commonly held view that race is so divisive that whites, blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans cannot work together in a common cause. And those articulating this vision must realize that if a political message is tailored to a white audience, people of color draw back, just as whites draw back when a message is tailored to racial minority audiences. The challenge is to find issues and programs that concern the families of all racial and ethnic groups so that individuals in these groups can honestly perceive mutual interests and join in a multiracial coalition to move America forward. In the age of Donald Trump, I feel even more strongly about this. In my 1999 book, I called upon the American people, and especially the leaders of the poor, the working classes, the displaced and the marginalized, the downsides and the de-skilled, to discuss in vocabularies that unite all racial groups the true task before us. I repeat that message with even greater urgency today. Thank you.